The senior resident's hands froze mid-unwrap, surgical scissors clattering to the sterile floor as the bandages peeled away from Franklin Washington's leg. What should have been rotting flesh after 30 years was something else entirely. "Get Dr. Martinez in here, now." The nurse's voice cracked as she stepped backward, her face draining of color. The attending physician, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything, pressed his palm against the wall for support. Dorothy Washington clutched her purse tighter in the hallway, remembering how Frank had limped to their mailbox every morning for 3 decades, never once complaining. Her husband's stubborn pride had hidden this from everyone, even her. "Call the CDC immediately," Dr. Martinez commanded, his voice barely steady as he stared at the impossibility before him. What had Frank's body been doing all these years? And how had love, quiet, desperate, unspoken love, created what medical science couldn't explain? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Franklin Frank Washington had always been a man of routine. At 70, he still rose at 5:30 a.m. sharp, brewed his coffee black as motor oil, and settled into his worn leather recliner with the Arizona Republic spread across his lap. "Everything's fine," he'd tell his wife Dorothy when she'd catch him wincing as he stood. "Back in my day, we didn't run crying to doctors every time something ached." Dorothy Washington had heard those words for 45 years of marriage. At 68, she'd learned to read the spaces between her husband's sentences, the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking, how he favored his left leg on rainy days. She'd been a school secretary for 30 years before retiring, trained to notice what children tried to hide. Frank wasn't so different. Their modest ranch home in Phoenix sat like 1,000 others in the neighborhood, American flag hanging from the porch, family photos crowding the mantelpiece, and Frank's workshop tucked into the garage like a sanctuary. The house showed subtle signs of financial strain, generic brands in the pantry, thermostat set higher in summer, lower in winter. But Frank's pride kept up appearances, just like it kept him in long pants year-round, even in Arizona's brutal heat. Dr. Samuel Washington, their 42-year-old son, lived 2 hours away in downtown Phoenix, building his cardiology practice and trying to forget how seldom he called home. Recently divorced, he threw himself into work, telling himself that saving other people's hearts somehow made up for neglecting his own family's. His success felt hollow when measured against his father's quiet strength. The way Frank could fix any engine, solve any household crisis with nothing but determination and a toolbox older than Samuel himself. Emma Washington, Samuel's wife of 15 years, understood the family dynamics better than her husband realized. As an ICU nurse, she recognized the signs Frank tried to hide, the careful way he positioned himself in chairs, how he gripped the porch railing when climbing steps. She'd grown up as Dorothy's orphaned niece, taken in at 12 after her parents died, and she knew this family's capacity for silent sacrifice. Mrs. Betty Henderson, 75 and widowed for a decade, lived next door and had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial guardian. She noticed everything. How Frank's morning walks had grown shorter, how Dorothy's grocery trips had become more frequent, but the bags seemed lighter. Betty had survived the Depression, buried 2 husbands, and raised 5 children. She knew when a family was struggling, even when they were too proud to admit it. The morning everything changed, Frank was in his workshop as usual, tinkering with a 1987 Chevy pickup that had been almost running for 3 years. The autumn air carried the scent of creosote and distant rain. Dorothy was inside, folding laundry and worrying about their mounting medical bills, the ones Frank thought he'd hidden so carefully. Neither of them knew that 30 years of secrets were about to unravel with a single phone call from their son. The call came at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other. Samuel was reviewing patient charts in his Phoenix office when his phone buzzed with his mother's number. Dorothy never called this early unless something was wrong. "Samuel, honey, I need you to come home." Her voice carried that careful control he remembered from childhood, the tone she used when she was trying not to scare him. "It's your father." "What happened? Is he hurt?" He he fell this morning, by the back fence. I found him trying to get up, but his leg—" She paused and Samuel could hear her breathing. "He says he's fine, but he's not walking right. He won't let me help him." Samuel was already reaching for his keys. "Mom, call 911. Get him to the hospital." "You know your father. He's locked himself in that workshop, says it's just a pulled muscle, says he doesn't need any fuss." Dorothy's voice cracked slightly. "Samuel, I'm scared." "He looks gray." Within minutes, Samuel was speeding down Interstate 10, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he called Emma at the hospital. "I need you to meet me at my parents' house. Dad's hurt, and you know how he is about doctors." Emma had seen this coming. For months, she'd watched Frank's careful movements during family dinners, the way he'd position himself so his right leg bore less weight. As a nurse, she recognized the signs of someone managing chronic pain. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't let him see you're panicking. It'll make him dig his heels in deeper." When Samuel pulled into his childhood driveway, the familiar sight of the ranch house hit him with unexpected emotion. How long had it been since he'd really looked at it? The paint was peeling around the window frames, the lawn looked thin, and his father's prized rose bushes seemed smaller than he remembered. Dorothy met him at the front door, her face etched with 30 years of accumulated worry. "He's been out there for an hour. Won't come in, won't talk to me. Just keeps saying he's got work to do." Through the kitchen window, Samuel could see the workshop's open door and hear the familiar sounds of tools clanking. But there was something off in the rhythm, starts and stops, like someone working in pain. Emma arrived as Samuel approached the workshop. Frank was hunched over his workbench, ostensibly organizing socket wrenches, but his movements were stiff, deliberate. His right leg was positioned awkwardly, taking no weight. "Hey, Dad." Samuel kept his voice casual. "Mom said you took a spill." Frank didn't look up. "Your mother worries too much. Always has. I've handled worse than a little tumble." He attempted to stand straight, and Samuel saw him grip the workbench edge. "Back in my day, we didn't run crying to doctors every time we got a bruise." Emma stepped forward with her gentle nurse's manner. "Frank, let me take a look, just to put Dorothy's mind at ease." "I said I'm fine." Frank's voice carried an edge Samuel had rarely heard. Not anger, but something closer to fear. "Don't need a house full of people fussing over nothing." "Dad, you're scaring Mom. She's been worried sick." Samuel moved closer, noticing how his father's face had taken on a grayish pallor. "Just let Emma check you out. If everything's okay, we'll leave you alone." Frank's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know my own body? Been living in it for 70 years. But as he spoke, he swayed slightly, catching himself against the workbench. Dorothy appeared in the doorway. "Frank Washington, you stubborn fool! For once in your life, let someone help you!" The words hung in the desert air like a challenge. Frank looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw 45 years of patience wearing thin. He saw his son, successful and worried, making time in his important life for his old man's troubles. He saw Emma, who'd grown up in this house and loved them all enough to drive across town on a moment's notice. "It's not that simple," Frank said quietly, his voice losing its defensive edge. "You don't understand." "Then help us understand." Samuel stepped closer. "Dad, whatever it is, we can handle it. We're family." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands still gripping the workbench. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Some things a man carries alone." Emma recognized the look in his eyes. The same look she'd seen in countless patients who'd been managing pain for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to ask for help. "Frank," she said gently, Sometimes carrying something alone for too long is what makes it too heavy to bear. After what felt like an eternity, Frank slowly nodded. All right, but just a quick look, and then we're done talking about it. None of them could have imagined that this moment of surrender would lead to discoveries that would change their understanding of love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be a hero. The ride to Phoenix General Hospital felt like the longest hour of Dorothy's life. Frank sat rigid in the passenger seat of Samuel's car, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. Every bump in the road made him wince, though he tried to hide it behind muttered complaints about Samuel's driving. "This is a waste of everyone's time," Frank said for the third time as they pulled into the hospital parking lot. "Quick checkup, that's all. Then we go home." Emma had called ahead, using her connections to expedite the process. She met them at the emergency room entrance with a wheelchair, which Frank eyed like it was a death sentence. "I can walk just fine." "Hospital policy, Frank," Emma said firmly. "Everyone gets a wheelchair ride." The triage nurse, a woman about Dorothy's age with kind eyes, took one look at Frank's pale complexion and moved him to the front of the line. Within minutes, they were in an examination room where Dr. Patricia Martinez, the senior emergency physician, introduced herself. "Mr. Washington, I understand you took a fall this morning. Can you tell me what happened?" Frank's story was rehearsed, mechanical. "Slipped, fixing the fence, twisted my leg a bit. Nothing serious." But when Dr. Martinez asked him to remove his pants for examination, something shifted in his demeanor. The confident facade cracked, revealing something that looked like panic. "I'd rather not," Frank said quietly. "Like I said, it's just a bruise." Dr. Martinez had been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years. She'd learned to read the subtext in patients' reluctance. "Mr. Washington, I need to examine the injury to help you properly. Your family is concerned, and frankly, so am I. Your vital signs suggest you're in significant pain." Samuel stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Dad, please." "Let her help." Frank looked around the room, at Dorothy's worried face, at Samuel's professional concern, at Emma's nurse's intuition. The walls he'd built over 30 years were crumbling under the weight of their collective love and worry. There's more than just today's fall," Frank admitted, his voice barely audible. "But what I'm about to show you, it looks worse than it is. I've been managing it fine on my own." Dr. Martinez nodded reassuringly. "Mr. Washington, I've seen everything. Nothing you show me is going to shock me." Frank slowly began to roll up his right pant leg, then stopped. "Promise me something. Whatever you see, remember that I've been taking care of it. It's under control." "Dad, what are you talking about?" Samuel's medical training was kicking in, his mind racing through possibilities. Instead of answering, Frank slowly removed his pants, revealing layers upon layers of carefully applied bandages from his mid-thigh to his ankle. The wrappings were clean, professionally done, changed recently, but there were so many of them that his leg appeared twice its normal size. Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious. "Mr. Washington, how long have you been dealing with this injury?" Frank couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Since 1975. The room fell silent. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. Emma, despite her nursing experience, felt her stomach drop. 49 years? Dr. Martinez's voice was carefully controlled. "Mr. Washington, I need to examine this immediately." As she began to unwrap the bandages, Frank's story tumbled out in fragments. It was in Vietnam. Chemical burn from enemy fire. Real bad. But the mission was classified, see? Couldn't get proper treatment through the VA. Had to figure it out myself. Dorothy's eyes widened. In all their years of marriage, Frank had rarely spoken about his service. She'd assumed his reluctance came from typical military stoicism, not from hiding an injury of this magnitude. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us?" Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm a doctor. I could have helped." "Didn't want to be a burden," Frank said simply. "Been handling it fine all these years. Change the dressing twice a day, keep it clean, keep working. That's what we did back then. We handled our own problems." As Dr. Martinez continued unwrapping, more medical staff began filtering into the room. The injury, when finally revealed, was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The entire lower portion of Frank's leg showed signs of severe chemical burns, but instead of the infected necrotic tissue they expected after decades of self-treatment, there was something extraordinary. The wound had formed a complex network of scar tissue that seemed to have created its own protective barrier. There were several fluid-filled cysts, but they appeared contained, almost organized. The skin around the edges showed signs of continuous regeneration and healing. "Mr. Washington," Dr. Martinez said slowly, "I need to be honest with you. What I'm seeing here defies conventional medical understanding. By all rights, an injury this severe, left untreated for this long, should have resulted in serious infection, amputation, or worse." Frank nodded. "I know it looks bad, but like I said, I've been managing it. Clean it twice daily, apply fresh bandages, keep the area dry. Learned some things from the medics overseas about wound care. The problem is," Dr. Martinez continued, "we need to run extensive tests. Blood work, tissue samples, imaging. This isn't something I can clear you for with a simple examination." "Tests cost money," Frank said quickly, his panic returning. "Insurance. I'm not sure what Medicare covers for something like this." Samuel started to speak, but Dr. Martinez cut him off. "Mr. Washington, given the unique nature of your case, I'm required to contact the Centers for Disease Control. They'll want to document this for medical research purposes." Frank's face went white. "The CDC? No, that's not. I don't want any government attention. Can't you just prescribe some antibiotics and send me home?" But even as he spoke, Frank was swaying on the examination table. The stress of revelation, combined with the infection that his body had been fighting for decades, was finally taking its toll. Emma stepped forward, her nursing instincts taking over. "Frank, you need to stay. This isn't something you can handle alone anymore." As Frank reluctantly agreed to admission, none of them realized that the truth he'd revealed was only the beginning. The real secrets about Vietnam, about money, about the true nature of heroism, were still buried beneath 30 years of careful lies. By the third day in the hospital, Frank's room had become a makeshift command center for the Washington family crisis. Dorothy had claimed the uncomfortable recliner by the window, refusing to leave despite Samuel and Emma's attempts to convince her to go home and rest. Medical charts covered the rolling table, insurance forms created small mountains on the windowsill, and the local news had somehow gotten wind of the Vietnam veterans' medical miracle. The story had taken on a life of its own. Channel 12 News had run a segment titled "Local Heroes' Decades-Long Battle," portraying Frank as a stoic warrior who'd silently endured his war wounds without complaint. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and practiced sympathy, had interviewed neighbors who spoke glowingly of Frank's character, how he'd fixed Mrs. Henderson's fence last winter, how he'd taught the Morrison boy to change a tire, how he'd never missed a neighborhood barbecue despite his obvious discomfort. Frank watched the coverage from his hospital bed with growing unease. Each accolade felt like another weight added to his chest. "Turn it off," he'd mutter whenever Dorothy reached for the remote, but she seemed fascinated by this public recognition of the man she'd lived with for 45 years. "Look at this," Dorothy said. holding up a card from the stack of well wishes that had arrived. "Mrs. Peterson from down the street says she always wondered how you kept going. Says you're an inspiration." Her voice carried pride mixed with something else, a note of discovery, as if she were learning about her husband through strangers' eyes. Samuel divided his time between his cardiology practice and the hospital, trying to manage both his patients and his father's increasingly complex medical situation. The infectious disease specialist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, had taken over Frank's case, and her findings were raising more questions than answers. "Your father's wound management has been remarkably sophisticated," Dr. Chen explained during one of their daily consultations. "The way he's maintained sterile conditions, rotated antibiotic ointments to prevent resistance, created drainage systems. It's almost like he had formal medical training." "He was a medic in Vietnam," Samuel said, though something in his father's behavior made him question even this basic assumption. Frank became agitated whenever medical staff asked for specifics about his military service, deflecting questions with vague references to classified missions. Emma, meanwhile, had become the family's translator, helping Dorothy navigate insurance paperwork and medical terminology. Her nursing background made her invaluable, but it also made her more aware of the financial implications mounting around them. "The CDC involvement is actually good news," she explained to Dorothy as they sat in the hospital cafeteria. "It means some of the research costs might be covered under federal programs, but the immediate treatment—" She paused, calculating. "We're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands in medical bills." Dorothy's coffee grew cold as she processed this information. "Frank's been so worried about money lately, more than usual. I've caught him going through our papers at night, making lists." She looked up at Emma with sudden clarity. "You don't think he's been hiding medical expenses, do you?" Emma's silence was answer enough. The financial stress was becoming as dangerous as Frank's medical condition. Samuel had offered repeatedly to help cover costs, but Frank's pride created an impenetrable barrier. "I don't take charity," Frank had declared when Samuel mentioned paying for a private room. "Worked my whole life, paid my taxes, earned my benefits. That should be enough." But Medicare's coverage for Frank's unique situation was murky at best. The decades-old injury fell into gray areas of policy, and the experimental nature of his treatment created additional complications. Insurance representatives made daily calls, each conversation ending with more forms to fill out, more documentation required. Mrs. Henderson had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial coordinator, organizing meal trains and visiting schedules. She arrived at the hospital each afternoon at precisely 2 p.m. carrying homemade soup and neighborhood gossip in equal measure. "The Morettis want to help with your yard work," she informed Frank during one visit, "and the church is taking up a collection." She set down a thermos of split pea soup and fixed Frank with a stern look. "Don't you dare say no. This is what neighbors do." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his bed. The outpouring of support made him feel simultaneously grateful and fraudulent. These people saw him as a war hero, a man who'd sacrificed for his country and suffered in silence. The truth felt like a betrayal of their good intentions. Dr. Chen's daily examinations revealed a wound that, while extensive, showed remarkable signs of long-term management. "Mr. Washington, I have to ask, where did you learn these techniques? Some of what you've done is more advanced than what we were teaching in medical schools 30 years ago." Frank's answers remained vague. "Picked things up here and there. Had a good medic in my unit who taught us field care." But his eyes didn't meet hers when he spoke, and his hands fidgeted with the blanket edge. Samuel began to notice inconsistencies in his father's war stories. Details changed between tellings, dates didn't align, and Frank's knowledge of Vietnam geography seemed surprisingly limited for someone who'd spent time there. When Samuel tried to ask direct questions about Frank's service record, his father would deflect or become agitated. "I need to contact the VA about Dad's benefits," Samuel told Emma one evening as they drove home. "But every time I mention it, he gets upset, says his records are classified, that I shouldn't go digging around." Emma had been thinking the same thing. "In all the years I've known your family, I've never seen any military memorabilia in your parents' house. No photos, no medals, no unit reunions. Don't you think that's odd for someone with such a significant service-connected injury?" The question hung between them as they pulled into their driveway. Samuel realized that despite growing up in Frank's house, he knew remarkably little about his father's actual military experience. Frank had always been more comfortable talking about engines than emotions, more likely to teach practical skills than share personal history. Back at the hospital, Frank lay awake staring at the ceiling. The morphine helped with the physical pain, but it couldn't touch the deeper ache of deception. For 30 years, he'd carried this secret, and now it was expanding beyond his control. The media attention, the community support, the medical interest, all of it built on a foundation of lies. Dorothy dozed in the recliner beside his bed, her hand still clutching the latest batch of get-well cards. In sleep, the worry lines in her face softened, and Frank could see traces of the young woman he'd married. She'd trusted him completely for 45 years, never questioning his version of events, never pushing for details he wasn't ready to share. The worst part wasn't the physical pain or even the financial stress. It was the growing weight of undeserved admiration. Every news story, every neighborly gesture, every expression of gratitude for his service felt like a stone added to a pile that would eventually crush him. Dr. Chen's latest report included recommendations for long-term care that would require ongoing medical supervision. The wound, while stable, needed professional monitoring to prevent the infection that had been threatening for decades. Frank's self-treatment had been remarkably effective, but his aging body was losing the battle against time and bacteria. "We're looking at months of treatment," Dr. Chen had explained to the family. "Possibly surgery to remove some of the damaged tissue, definitely ongoing antibiotic therapy, physical therapy to restore mobility." The unspoken implication hung in the air. The cost would be staggering. Samuel found himself torn between his medical knowledge and his filial duty. As a doctor, he understood the necessity of aggressive treatment. As a son, he saw how each day in the hospital diminished his father's spirit. Frank had always been a man of action, solving problems with his hands and his determination. Being bedridden, dependent on others, accepting charity, it was killing him as surely as any infection. Emma watched the family dynamics with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years managing medical crises. She could see Dorothy's exhaustion, Samuel's guilt, and Frank's growing desperation. The secret that had started as a young man's shame was becoming a family's destruction. Late at night, when the hospital grew quiet, Frank would reach for the notebook he'd kept hidden in his nightstand. For 30 years, he'd documented his wound care, detailed records of treatments, observations about healing, modifications to his routine. It was the work of someone with genuine medical knowledge, someone who'd studied his condition with scientific precision. The notebook was filled with sketches, measurements, and careful notations that revealed Frank's true intelligence and dedication. But it also contained other entries, fragments of the real story, the truth he'd never been able to tell. As his strength failed and his defenses crumbled, Frank began to realize that the secret he'd protected for 3 decades might finally demand its freedom. The story that would emerge would surprise everyone who thought they knew Frank Washington. The real tale of heroism was more complex than any war story, and the courage it had required was of a different kind entirely. The breaking point came on day 8, when the morning news ran a follow-up story that made Frank's hands shake as he reached for the remote. The reporter had done her homework this time, digging deeper into the local war hero story that had captured the community's imagination. "We've been trying to verify Mr. Washington's military service records," the perky blonde reporter announced with the enthusiasm of someone who thought she was doing good journalism. "The Department of Veterans Affairs says they're still researching his classified file. But we did speak with several Vietnam veterans from the Phoenix area who are eager to connect with a fellow soldier who served with such distinction." Frank felt the blood drain from his face as the camera panned across a group of elderly men in Veterans of Foreign Wars caps, each one expressing admiration for his courage and hoping to meet him once he recovered. One man, about Frank's age with kind eyes and a VFW patch, spoke directly into the camera. "What this brother went through, carrying that wound all these years without asking for help. That's the kind of sacrifice we all understand. We'd be honored to have him join our post once he's back on his feet." Dorothy looked up from her crossword puzzle, noting Frank's pale complexion. "Honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank couldn't answer. The weight of 49 years was crushing down on him, and for the first time since 1975, he felt like he might actually suffocate under the pressure of his own deception. Samuel arrived at noon for his daily visit, bringing Emma and a stack of insurance paperwork that seemed to grow thicker each day. The financial picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't good news. "Dad, we need to talk about the costs," Samuel said gently, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "The insurance company is balking at covering some of the experimental treatments Dr. Chen is recommending. They want more documentation of the original injury." Frank's jaw tightened. "What kind of documentation?" Emma spoke up, her voice careful and professional. "They want your military medical records, evidence that this is a service-connected injury. It would make all the difference in coverage. The VA would pick up costs that Medicare won't cover." "I told you," Frank said, his voice rising slightly. "Those records are classified. You can't just call up the government and ask for classified information." Samuel exchanged a glance with Emma. His father's agitation seemed disproportionate to the request. "Dad, it's just paperwork. Military medical records aren't usually classified unless they involve chemical weapons or—" "Drop it!" Frank's voice cracked like a whip. "I said drop it, and I mean it. Find another way to pay for this mess, but leave my service record alone." Dorothy set down her crossword puzzle, studying her husband's face with the intensity of someone who'd been reading his expressions for nearly half a century. Something was deeply wrong, and it went beyond pain or financial stress. Dr. Chen chose that moment to enter with her daily update, clipboard in hand, and a slight frown creasing her forehead. "Mr. Washington, I'm afraid I have some concerning news. The tissue samples we took yesterday show signs of a bacterial strain that's not responding to our current antibiotic regimen." The room fell silent. Frank closed his eyes, feeling the last of his control slipping away. "What does that mean?" Dorothy asked, though her voice suggested she already knew it wasn't good. "It means we need to be more aggressive with treatment. I'm recommending immediate surgical debridement, removal of the infected tissue, followed by a course of intravenous antibiotics that will require at least 2 weeks of hospitalization." Samuel felt his world tilt. "Dr. Chen, what are we looking at in terms of costs? Conservative estimate? $150,000? That's assuming no complications." Frank made a sound that was part laugh, part sob. $150,000. He repeated the number like it was a foreign phrase he was trying to learn. "For something that's been fine for 30 years. "Mr. Washington," Dr. Chen said gently, "your self-care has been remarkable, but your body can't fight this infection much longer. Without treatment, we're looking at sepsis, possible amputation, or worse." Dorothy reached for Frank's hand, but he pulled away. The gesture was so unlike him that it made her take a sharp breath. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. Given the unusual nature of your case, the CDC wants to bring in a specialist from their infectious disease unit, Dr. Patricia Homeland from Atlanta. She's one of the country's leading experts on chronic wound management. Frank's eyes flew open. No, absolutely not. No more specialists, no more tests, no more government people poking around. Frank, Dorothy said quietly, what are you so afraid of? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for decades. Frank looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw 45 years of trust, patience, and unconditional love. He saw his son, who'd become a doctor, partly to honor what he thought was his father's military service. He saw Emma, who'd grown up believing in the family mythology he'd carefully constructed. You want to know what I'm afraid of? Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm afraid that when you learn the truth, you'll never look at me the same way again. Samuel moved closer to the bed. Dad, whatever it is. No. Frank's voice gained strength. You don't understand. All of this. The news stories, the neighbors bringing food, the VFW veterans wanting to meet me. It's all based on a lie. A lie I've been telling for so long, I almost started believing it myself. Dorothy felt something cold settle in her stomach. What lie, Frank? Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet they had to lean in to hear him. I was never in Vietnam. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of their lives. Samuel felt like he'd been punched in the chest. What? I never served in Vietnam. Never served anywhere. Frank's voice was gaining momentum now, like a dam finally giving way. I was 19 years old, working at Consolidated Chemical just outside Phoenix, March 15, 1975. There was an accident, a valve failure in the processing plant. I got caught in a cloud of industrial chemicals. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. Emma sank into the visitor's chair, her nursing experience helping her process the medical implications while her heart struggled with the emotional ones. The company was facing lawsuits, worker safety violations, potential criminal charges, Frank continued. They offered me a settlement. $50,000, which was a fortune to a 19-year-old kid in 1975, if I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement and seek all my medical treatment privately. Samuel's voice was hoarse. Dad, why didn't you? Because I was 19 and stupid and thought $50,000 would last forever, Frank said bitterly, and because I was ashamed. All my friends were coming back from Vietnam as heroes or casualties, and I was just some factory worker who got hurt because he wasn't paying attention to safety protocols. The room was dead silent except for the mechanical sounds of the hospital. Ventilation systems, distant monitors, the soft squeak of wheels in the hallway. When I met your mother 6 months later, Frank continued, looking at Dorothy with eyes full of pain. Vietnam was ending, and everybody assumed any young man with a serious injury had served overseas. It was easier to let people think what they wanted to think than to explain that I was just a careless kid who got hurt at work. Dorothy's world was reorganizing itself around this new information. 45 years of marriage suddenly reframed. Frank, why didn't you ever tell me? At first I thought I would. But then we fell in love, and you were so proud of what you thought I'd done for my country. And then we got married, and time passed, and the lie got bigger and bigger until it felt impossible to tell the truth. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing this family crisis unfold, spoke carefully. Mr. Washington, industrial chemical burns from the 1970s. Some of those chemicals have been linked to long-term health complications. The settlement money and NDA might actually work in your favor for current treatment costs. Frank laughed bitterly. The settlement money's been gone for 20 years, spent it all on medical supplies trying to manage this thing without anyone finding out the truth. Emma found her voice. Frank, You've been treating this injury for 30 years with no formal medical training. That's actually incredible." "It's not incredible," Frank said, his voice breaking. "It's just what you do when you've painted yourself into a corner with lies and you're too proud and too stubborn to ask for help." The truth was finally out, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. And just like the chemical accident that had started it all, no one could predict exactly how much damage it would cause before the cleanup was complete. The silence that followed Frank's confession felt like a living thing, pressing against the walls of the hospital room and making it hard to breathe. Dorothy stared at her hands, processing 45 years of marriage through a completely different lens. Samuel stood frozen by the window, his entire understanding of his father crumbling like a building with its foundation removed. Emma, ever the nurse, was the first to find her voice. "Frank, how much money do you have left from managing this over the years?" Frank's laugh was hollow, bitter. "Money? Emma, honey, I haven't had any real money in decades. The settlement ran out in the late 90s, and since then—" He trailed off, looking older than his 70 years. "Since then what?" Dorothy's voice was sharp, cutting through the emotional fog. She was starting to piece together years of small deceptions. The way Frank handled all the finances, his insistence on managing their budget alone, his growing anxiety about money in recent years. Frank couldn't meet her eyes. "Since then, I've been using credit cards, taking cash advances, refinancing the house." He paused, the words sticking in his throat like broken glass. "Dorothy, I sold the house 6 months ago." The second bombshell hit the room with even more force than the first. Dorothy's face went white, then flushed red with an anger Samuel had never seen in his gentle mother. "You sold our house?" Her voice was dangerously quiet. "Our home? The place where I raised our son? Where we've lived for 30 years? You sold it without telling me?" "I had to," Frank said desperately. "The medical bills were mounting, and I knew this day would come. I knew eventually I'd need real medical care, and I needed money to pay for it." "I was trying to protect you. Protect me." Dorothy stood up so quickly the visitor's chair rolled backward. "By lying to me about everything? By selling our home behind my back? By letting me live 45 years believing I was married to a war hero when I was actually married to—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Samuel finally found his voice. "Dad, where are we supposed to live? Where is Mom supposed to live?" Frank's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for decades. "I've been renting it back from the new owners. They're good people. They understood the situation. But the lease runs out in 3 months and I don't know." His voice broke completely. Dr. Chen quietly excused herself, recognizing that this family crisis required privacy more than medical intervention. As the door closed behind her, Dorothy began pacing the small room like a caged animal. 45 years, she said, her voice gaining strength and fury with each repetition. 45 years of lies, of secrets, of treating me like I was too fragile or too stupid to handle the truth. "It wasn't like that," Frank pleaded. "I was trying to spare you." "Spare me what, Frank? Spare me the chance to love you for who you really are instead of who you pretended to be. Spare me the opportunity to help you carry this burden. Spare me the right to make decisions about my own life, my own home." Emma watched the disintegration of her husband's family with growing horror. Samuel stood paralyzed, caught between his medical training that told him his father needed immediate care and his emotional reality that was being turned inside out. "I need air," Dorothy announced, suddenly. "I need to get out of this room." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, then turned back. "And Frank, don't you dare have them do any more tests or procedures until I get back." "You've made enough decisions for this family without consulting anyone." The door slammed behind her with a finality that made everyone flinch. Samuel sank into the chair his mother had vacated, putting his head in his hands. Dad, how could you? How could you lie about something this big for this long? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. When you're 19 and ashamed and trying to impress a girl, you tell yourself it's just a little white lie. When you're 25 and married and building a life, you tell yourself it doesn't matter anymore. When you're 40 and have a son who looks at you like you're a hero, you tell yourself you'll take it to your grave. But you didn't take it to your grave, Emma said quietly. It's been eating you alive instead. Frank nodded, tears flowing freely now. Every Veterans Day, every 4th of July, every time someone thanked me for my service, it was like swallowing poison, but I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to tell the truth without destroying everything. Samuel looked up at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Dad, what you did, managing this injury for 30 years with no formal training, working every day despite chronic pain, providing for our family, that takes a different kind of courage. Does it? Frank asked bitterly. Because right now it feels like I've just destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. Your mother. God, Samuel, the look in her eyes. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, then looked up with alarm. It's Dorothy. She says she's going home to pack a bag. She's going to stay with her sister in Tucson. Frank closed his eyes as if the words were physical blows. How long? She doesn't say. Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the hospital cafeteria, Dorothy sat with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, her mind reeling through decades of small moments that suddenly made sense. Frank's reluctance to attend veterans' events, his anxiety when military documentaries came on television, the way he'd changed the subject whenever someone asked specific questions about his service. Mrs. Henderson appeared at her table as if summoned by some supernatural radar for family crises. At 75, Betty Henderson had seen enough of life to recognize a woman in the midst of having her world turned upside down. "Honey, you look like you've been hit by a truck," Betty said, settling into the opposite chair without invitation. "Betty, what are you doing here?" "Came to check on Frank, same as every day. But I can see the real crisis isn't in his hospital room." Betty's sharp eyes took in Dorothy's red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands. "Want to tell me what that husband of yours has done now?" For a moment, Dorothy considered maintaining the family's privacy, protecting Frank's secrets even now. But 45 years of being the keeper of someone else's truth had left her exhausted. "He lied to me, Betty. About everything. About who he is, about his military service, about our finances. He sold our house 6 months ago and didn't tell me." Betty's eyebrows rose, but she didn't look shocked. "Honey, I've been living next door to you for 15 years. I've watched that man carry himself like someone bearing a weight too heavy for his shoulders. I've seen him work on that old truck in his garage at 2 in the morning because he couldn't sleep. I've watched him take care of everyone else's problems while clearly struggling with his own. That doesn't excuse lying to me for 45 years. "No, it doesn't," Betty agreed, "but it might explain it. Sometimes when people are drowning, they grab on to whatever floats by, even if it's not sturdy enough to hold them forever." Dorothy finally took a sip of her coffee, finding it had gone cold. "I don't know how to forgive this, Betty. I don't know how to go back to trusting someone who's been lying to me since the day we met." "Who says you have to go back?" Betty asked quietly. "Maybe the question isn't how to return to what was, but how to build something new with what's true." Back in Frank's room, Samuel was on the phone with the billing department trying to understand the full scope of their financial crisis. The numbers were staggering, not just the current hospitalization, but years of accumulated medical debt that Frank had been hiding. "We're looking at over $400,000 in total debt," Samuel told Emma quietly. "The house sale covered maybe half of it," Frank overheard. "Son, you don't understand. I never wanted this to be your burden. I thought I could handle it all myself, right to the end." "Well, you can't," Samuel said, his voice harder than he intended. "And now we're all going to handle it together, whether you like it or not." The family that had seemed so solid that morning was now fractured, possibly beyond repair. And the worst part was that Frank's original injury, the one that had started all the lies, was getting worse by the hour. 3 days passed in a fog of medical procedures and family silence. Dorothy had indeed gone to her sister's house in Tucson, leaving behind only a note that said she needed time to think. Frank's condition deteriorated rapidly without the stabilizing force of his wife's presence, as if his body had been holding itself together through sheer will, and that will was finally breaking. Dr. Chen delivered the news that everyone had been dreading. Frank's infection had spread, and immediate surgery was necessary to prevent sepsis. The procedure would cost another $60,000, money the family simply didn't have. Samuel sat in the consultation room, staring at medical bills that had become meaningless numbers, trying to figure out how to save his father's life without destroying what remained of their family's future. "There is one option," Dr. Chen said carefully. "If we can establish that this is a workplace injury from 1975, even with the non-disclosure agreement, there might be legal avenues for the original company to bear responsibility for current medical costs." Samuel looked up with the first spark of hope he'd felt in days. "Consolidated Chemical. Are they still in business?" "That's what we need to find out. But Mr. Washington would have to be willing to break his NDA and provide details about the original accident." When Samuel presented this option to Frank, his father's reaction was immediate and vehement. "Absolutely not. I signed that agreement, and I'm not going back on my word now. Those people trusted me to keep quiet." "Dad, those people caused a chemical accident that's been slowly killing you for 30 years, Samuel said, his voice rising with frustration. "They don't deserve your loyalty." "It's not about loyalty," Frank said weakly. "It's about integrity, about keeping your word. About not being the kind of man who breaks promises when things get hard." Emma, who had been quietly researching on her laptop, looked up from the screen. "Frank, what if I told you that Consolidated Chemical was shut down by the EPA in 1983 for environmental violations? What if the people you're protecting are long gone?" Frank's expression flickered with uncertainty. "That doesn't change anything. A promise is a promise." It was then that Betty Henderson chose to make her daily visit, carrying her usual offering of homemade soup and neighborhood wisdom. She took one look at Frank's pale complexion and the defeated expressions on Samuel and Emma's faces, and her maternal instincts kicked into overdrive. "All right, what's the crisis today?" she asked, settling into the visitor's chair with the authority of someone who'd been managing family emergencies since before Samuel was born. Samuel found himself explaining the situation to this neighbor who'd become an unexpected family anchor. Betty listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "So let me get this straight," she said when Samuel finished. "You're willing to die rather than break a promise you made to protect people who poisoned you and then paid you to keep quiet about it?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Henderson, with respect, you don't understand." "Oh, honey, I understand perfectly." Betty's voice carried the steel of someone who'd survived the Depression, 2 wars, and raising 5 children. "You've spent so many years trying to be the man you thought you should be, that you've forgotten how to be the man you actually are." She reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been well handled. "Frank Washington, I've been your neighbor for 15 years. And I've been watching you punish yourself for something that happened when you were barely more than a boy." Betty opened the folder and spread its contents on Frank's bedside table. There were newspaper clippings, legal documents, and what appeared to be medical records. "What is this?" Samuel asked, leaning forward to examine the papers. "This," Betty said with satisfaction, is everything I could find about the consolidated chemical accident of March 15, 1975. Turns out, Frank wasn't the only one who got hurt that day. Frank's face went white as he recognized official documents he thought had been buried forever. 17 workers were exposed to toxic chemicals, Betty continued. 3 died within a year. 8 others developed chronic health conditions. The company paid settlements to keep everyone quiet, but they also violated federal safety regulations, lied to investigators, and covered up evidence of previous accidents. Emma picked up one of the newspaper clippings dated 1984. Frank, look at this. There was a class action lawsuit 9 years after your accident. Former Consolidated workers sued the company's insurance carrier for ongoing medical costs. They won, Betty added with grim satisfaction, to the tune of $47 million. The insurance company was required to establish a fund for any worker who could prove injury from the 1975 incident. Frank stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. But my NDA was rendered void when the company was found to have committed fraud, Samuel said, reading from one of the legal papers. Dad, you could have been getting medical coverage for this injury for the past 20 years. But I didn't know, Frank whispered. Nobody told me about the lawsuit? Betty's expression softened. Honey, how could they tell you? You'd moved, changed your name when you got married, and weren't in contact with any of your former co-workers. They couldn't find you. The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. 30 years of suffering, of hiding, of destroying his family with lies and debt, all of it unnecessary. The money had been there waiting for him, if only he'd been brave enough to tell the truth. Emma was already on her phone calling the law firm that had handled the original class action suit. Within an hour, they'd confirmed that Franklin Washington was indeed eligible for the medical fund and that all his current treatment costs would be covered retroactively. But even as the financial crisis dissolved, the emotional damage remained. Dorothy was still in Tucson, still processing 45 years of deception. The community that had rallied around their war hero now knew the truth, and Frank wasn't sure which was worse, their pity or their sense of betrayal. Samuel called his mother that evening, hoping to share the good news about the medical coverage. Her response was measured, careful. I'm glad Frank will get the treatment he needs, she said. But Samuel, this doesn't fix everything. This doesn't change the fact that he lied to me about who he was for our entire marriage. Mom, he was trying to protect you. No. Dorothy's voice was firm. He was protecting himself. From embarrassment, from shame, from having to deal with the consequences of his choices. He let me build my life around a fantasy. Samuel felt the conversation slipping away from him. What are you saying? Are you leaving him? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was tired, aged by the weight of recent revelations. I'm saying I need time to figure out who I am when I'm not living someone else's carefully constructed lie. I'm 68 years old, Samuel. I may not have much time left to live authentically. After Samuel hung up, he sat in his car in the hospital parking lot, trying to process the fact that solving his father's medical crisis might not be enough to save his parents' marriage. Frank had been so focused on protecting his secret that he'd never considered the possibility that the secret itself might destroy what he was trying to protect. Back in Frank's room, Betty was packing up her research materials. Honey, you've got the medical part figured out now, but you've still got some work to do on the rest of it. Frank nodded, looking older and more fragile than Betty had ever seen him. Mrs. Henderson, what if it's too late? What if I've broken things that can't be fixed? Betty paused at the door, considering her words carefully. Frank, I've been married twice, buried 2 husbands, and raised 5 children. I've learned that the only things that can't be fixed are the things we're too proud or too scared to work on. She softened her tone. That woman has loved you for 45 years. Not the war hero she thought you were, but you. The man who got up every morning despite chronic pain, who worked every day to provide for his family, who taught your son to be honorable even when you felt like a fraud. How do you know that? Because I've been watching, Frank. For 15 years, I've watched you be the man Dorothy fell in love with. The uniform you never wore doesn't change that. As Betty left, Frank stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future where truth replaced deception, where love could exist without the burden of maintaining elaborate lies. For the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself to hope that such a future might be possible. But first, he had to figure out how to earn back the trust of the woman who'd shared his life without ever really knowing who he was. 2 weeks after Frank's surgery, he was finally well enough to be discharged. The medical fund had covered everything: the surgery, the extended hospital stay, the specialized wound care supplies he'd need for ongoing treatment. For the first time in 30 years, Frank Washington wasn't drowning in medical debt. But as Samuel helped him into the wheelchair for the ride home, Frank realized that financial freedom meant nothing without his family intact. Dorothy had returned from Tucson the day before, but she'd spent the night in the guest bedroom. She'd been polite but distant during the discharge process, handling paperwork and insurance forms with the efficiency of someone managing a business transaction rather than bringing her husband home. The easy intimacy that had defined their marriage for 4 decades seemed to have evaporated, replaced by careful courtesy that was somehow worse than anger. The drive home was silent, except for the radio playing soft country music that reminded Frank of better times. When they pulled into the driveway, he noticed that Dorothy had been busy during his hospitalization. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the flower beds weeded and replanted, the porch swept clean. It looked like the home of someone who'd been keeping busy to avoid thinking. "I've set up the guest room for you," Dorothy said as they entered the house. "Dr. Chen said you'll need to keep your leg elevated for another few weeks, and the bed in there is adjustable." Frank's heart sank. "Dorothy, we need to talk." "Yes, we do," she agreed. "But not today. Today you need to rest and recover. We'll have plenty of time to talk later." That evening, as Frank lay in the unfamiliar guest room bed, he could hear Dorothy moving around the kitchen, preparing what smelled like his favorite pot roast. For a moment, hope flickered in his chest. Maybe this was her way of saying she wanted to work things out. But when she brought him a tray with dinner, her demeanor remained carefully neutral. "Dorothy," he said as she turned to leave, "I know I don't deserve it, but will you sit with me for a few minutes?" She hesitated, then took the chair beside the bed. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 45 years and recent revelations hanging between them like a physical presence. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Dorothy finally said. "About us, about our marriage, about who I am when I'm not trying to be the wife of a man I never really knew." Frank's throat felt tight. "And what have you decided?" "I've decided that I'm angrier than I thought possible," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "Not just about the lies, Frank, but about the choice you took away from me. For 45 years, I made decisions based on information that wasn't true. I worried about the wrong things, celebrated the wrong achievements, built my identity around supporting a version of you that never existed." Frank felt tears burning his eyes. I know you never meant to hurt me," Dorothy continued, "but intent doesn't erase impact. You robbed me of the chance to love you for who you really are. You robbed me of the opportunity to make informed choices about my own life." "So what does that mean?" Frank asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Dorothy looked out the window at the garden she'd tended so carefully. "It means I need to figure out who Dorothy Washington is when she's not living in the shadow of someone else's fiction. I need to discover what I want what I believe, what makes me happy, separate from what I thought would make you happy. Are you leaving me? The question hung in the air for a long time before Dorothy answered. I don't know yet. I know I love you, Frank. But I'm not sure if I love the real you or the version you've been performing for the past 4 decades. And until I figure that out, I don't think we can move forward. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the window, Frank could see Mrs. Henderson on the front porch, holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. Dorothy went to answer the door, and Frank could hear muffled conversation from the living room. Betty Henderson had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial coordinator of Frank's recovery, and she arrived every few days with food, gossip, and unsolicited advice. Today, however, she seemed to have a specific agenda. Frank Washington, she announced as she marched into the guest room, I've got something to show you. She was carrying a photo album that Frank didn't recognize. Betty settled into the chair Dorothy had vacated and opened the album to the first page. These are pictures from the last 15 years, she said. Pictures I took at neighborhood barbecues, block parties, Christmas celebrations. I want you to look at them and tell me what you see. Frank found himself looking at images he'd forgotten. Candid shots of him helping neighbors with yard work, teaching kids to change tires, fixing Mrs. Peterson's fence after a storm. In every photo, he looked content, engaged, useful. Now look at this one, Betty said, turning to a picture from last year's 4th of July celebration. It showed Frank and Dorothy dancing in the Hendersons' backyard, both of them laughing at something off camera. What do you see in Dorothy's face? Betty asked. Frank studied his wife's expression in the photo. She looked genuinely happy, relaxed, in love. She looks content, happy. That's right. Now, Frank, do you think she was happy because she thought you were a war hero? Or do you think she was happy because she was dancing with a man who'd spent the day helping set up tables, fixing the Johnson's grill, and making sure the elderly neighbors had comfortable places to sit? Frank began to understand what Betty was showing him. In all these photos, he wasn't performing the role of a war hero. He was just being himself, helpful, dependable, kind. The man Dorothy fell in love with wasn't the fantasy soldier you invented, Betty continued. She fell in love with the man you actually are. The man who shows up when people need help. The man who works hard and takes care of his family. The man who's been quietly heroic in 1,000 small ways for decades. Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. But I lied to her, Mrs. Henderson, for our entire marriage. Yes, you did, Betty agreed bluntly, and that was wrong. But lying about where you got hurt doesn't change who you are in your heart. It doesn't change the way you've loved your family or served your community. She closed the photo album and fixed Frank with the same stern look she'd used on her own children when they needed a reality check. Now, you can spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for a mistake you made when you were 19, or you can figure out how to make amends and build something better with the time you have left. After Betty left, Frank lay in the guest room bed, thinking about the photos she'd shown him. For the first time in 30 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his worth as a man wasn't defined by a lie he'd told as a teenager, but by the life he'd actually lived. The next morning, Frank made a decision. Using the laptop Samuel had brought him, he began to write. Not another fictional account of military heroism, but the truth. All of it. The chemical accident, the fear and shame that followed, the way the lie had grown and metastasized over the years. He wrote about the weight of deception, the constant fear of discovery, the way secrets could poison even the most loving relationships. But he also wrote about Dorothy, her kindness, her strength, her capacity for love that had sustained him through decades of physical pain and emotional turmoil. He wrote about Samuel and Emma, about the family he'd been terrified of losing and had nearly destroyed through his efforts to protect it. When Dorothy found him typing the next morning, she read over his shoulder for several minutes before speaking. "What is this?" she asked. "It's a letter," Frank said. "To you, to Samuel, to anyone who'll listen. It's the truth about who I am and what I've done. All of it." Dorothy read a few more paragraphs, her expression unreadable. "What are you planning to do with it?" "I don't know yet," Frank admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But I needed to write it down. The real story. Not the version I've been telling myself to make the lies seem justified." For the first time since he'd been home, Dorothy's expression softened slightly. "It's a start, Frank. It's a start." Outside, the Arizona sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in 30 years, Frank Washington watched the sunset without the weight of deception pressing down on his shoulders. He still didn't know if his marriage could survive the truth, but at least now he was finally free to find out. 3 months after Frank's confession, the Washington family had settled into a new rhythm that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. Frank's physical recovery had progressed remarkably well. The professional medical care, combined with his decades of self-treatment knowledge, had finally brought his chronic wound under control, but the emotional healing proved more complex, requiring patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to rebuild trust from the ground up. Dorothy had moved back into their shared bedroom, but their relationship felt like starting over in many ways. They talked more than they had in years, often staying up late discussing not just the lies that had divided them, but the dreams and fears they'd never fully shared. Frank learned that Dorothy had always wanted to travel, that she'd given up her own ambitions to support what she thought were his needs as a traumatized veteran. Dorothy discovered that Frank's real dreams had been simpler. He'd wanted to be a good husband and father, to be useful to his community, to live with integrity even as he struggled with the weight of his deception. "I keep thinking about all the years we lost," Dorothy said one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "All the conversations we never had because you were too afraid to tell me the truth, and I was too respectful of your trauma to push for answers." Frank reached for her hand, a gesture that still felt tentative after months of rebuilding intimacy. "I can't give those years back. But maybe we can make the ones we have left count for more." Samuel visited every weekend now, often bringing Emma and their newborn daughter, Grace, a surprise pregnancy that had brought unexpected joy to the healing family. Frank's role as grandfather seemed to unlock something in him, a tenderness that years of carrying secrets had buried. He built a crib with his own hands, teaching Samuel woodworking skills that had been passed down through generations, creating new traditions built on truth rather than fiction. "It's funny," Samuel told Emma one Saturday afternoon as they watched Frank patiently showing their 3-month-old daughter how to grip a small wooden toy he'd carved. "I spent my whole childhood trying to live up to what I thought was his war record. Turns out, the man he actually is, that's so much more impressive than any military service could have been." Emma nodded, bouncing Grace gently as the baby fussed. 30 years of managing that injury on his own, working every day to provide for you and your mom, building a life based on love even when it was built on lies. That takes a different kind of courage." The community's response to Frank's revelation had been mixed but largely supportive. Some neighbors felt betrayed by the false war hero narrative, but others, led by Mrs. Henderson's fierce advocacy, recognized that Frank's actual contributions to their neighborhood were more meaningful than any military service. The VFW Post had quietly withdrawn their invitation, but the local Rotary Club had asked Frank to speak about his experience managing chronic pain and the importance of workplace safety, recognition that felt more genuine than any honor based on fictional heroism. Frank had taken Mrs. Henderson's advice and channeled his guilt into action. He'd become an advocate for industrial accident victims, working with lawyers to help other injured workers navigate the complex world of workers' compensation and medical coverage. His detailed journals from 30 years of self-treatment had become valuable resources for doctors treating similar injuries, and he'd been invited to speak at medical conferences about patient-directed wound care. "I never thought my shame could become something useful," Frank told the first conference audience he'd addressed. "But maybe that's how redemption works, turning the things that nearly destroyed you into tools to help others." Dr. Chen had documented Frank's case extensively, and his story had been published in medical journals as an example of how consistent, knowledgeable self-care could achieve remarkable results even in challenging circumstances. The attention felt different from the media circus that had surrounded his false war hero identity. This recognition was based on truth, on actual accomplishments, on knowledge gained through suffering and transformed into wisdom. Dorothy had surprised everyone, including herself, by enrolling in community college courses. At 68, she was pursuing the education she'd set aside when she married at 23. Her favorite class was American literature, where she was writing essays about truth and deception in marriage, using her own experience as source material. "I spent 45 years being who I thought Frank needed me to be," she explained to her classmates during a discussion about identity in contemporary women's writing. "Now I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not performing a role." The financial burden that had nearly destroyed them was completely gone. The Consolidated Chemical Settlement Fund had not only covered all of Frank's medical expenses, but had provided a substantial sum for ongoing care and lost wages. For the first time in decades, the Washington family was financially secure, able to plan for the future rather than just surviving day to day. Frank had used some of the settlement money to establish a small scholarship fund for children of industrial accident victims, a way of ensuring that other families wouldn't have to choose between medical care and education the way he had feared his own family might. But perhaps the most significant change was in Frank himself. The constant vigilance required to maintain his elaborate deception had been exhausting, and its absence left him feeling lighter, more present. He laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and seemed to inhabit his own life more fully than he had in decades. "I didn't realize how much energy it takes to maintain a lie," he told Samuel during one of their weekend visits. "Now that I don't have to remember what version of the story I told to whom, I can actually focus on living." The weekly family dinners that Dorothy had instituted became the cornerstone of their new normal. Every Sunday, the extended family gathered around the table that Frank had built in his workshop, sharing meals and stories and the kind of honest conversation that had been impossible when secrets lurked beneath every interaction. During one such dinner, little Grace began fussing, and Frank instinctively reached for her, settling her against his chest with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned patience through decades of managing pain. As the baby calmed, Frank looked around the table at his family, Dorothy grading papers from her literature class, Samuel and Emma planning their next weekend project, Mrs. Henderson, who'd become an honorary family member, arguing politics with Dorothy, and felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. "You know what I've learned?" Frank said to the assembled group. "The truth is scarier than lies when you're afraid of losing everything, but lies are scarier than truth when you realize what you're actually losing by keeping them." Emma looked up from helping Samuel plan their kitchen renovation. "What do you mean?" "I was so afraid that the truth would destroy my family that I nearly destroyed it with lies instead," Frank explained. "I thought I was protecting everyone, but I was really just protecting myself from having to face the consequences of choices I made when I was 19. Dorothy reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "The consequences weren't as terrible as you thought they'd be." "No," Frank agreed. They were different. Harder in some ways, easier in others, but they were real. And I'd rather deal with real consequences of real choices than live in a house of cards built on fiction. As the evening wound down and family members began to head home, Frank and Dorothy stood on their front porch watching Samuel load the baby's car seat, while Emma gathered the various toys and blankets that seemed to multiply whenever Grace visited. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" Dorothy asked, voicing the question that still sometimes kept her awake at night. Frank considered the question seriously, as he'd learned to consider all of Dorothy's concerns since beginning the work of rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of truth. "I think we're going to be different," he said finally. "We're going to be the couple who learned to love each other honestly, instead of the couple who loved each other based on carefully maintained illusions." "Whether that's okay, I guess we'll find out together." Dorothy leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of the man she was learning to know all over again. "I think different might be better than okay," she said. "I think different might be the best thing that ever happened to us." For our readers, aged 55-68, Frank's journey reminds us that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, authentic love over performed perfection. Many of us carry secrets, not as dramatic as Frank's perhaps, but burdens nonetheless. His story shows us that the relationships we think we're protecting with our silence might actually be strengthened by our honesty. The courage to be vulnerable, to admit our flaws and fears, often leads to deeper connections than we ever imagined possible. Sometimes the very thing we're most afraid to reveal is exactly what our loved ones need to see to truly know and love us. What secret burden are you carrying that might actually bring you closer to those you love if you found the courage to share it? Have you ever discovered that someone you cared about wasn't who you thought they were? And how did that change your relationship?